Hello, Marconi, and welcome to our final First Lady Friday. Today we're going to be talking about our very first two First Ladies, and this is our last First Lady Friday before we move on to our next Friday series, which is going to be a book club, and we will be reading Anne of Green Gables. So I'm really excited to wrap this series or this program up with you all and move on to our next program. So as I was learning a little bit about Martha Washington, I wanted to share some of the things that I found with you all. So Martha Washington wasn't always Martha Washington. George Washington was actually her second husband. So Martha's first marriage was to a man named Daniel Parke Custis. He was 20 years older than her. She got married when she was 18. And they had 4 children. 2 of the 4 died in childhood, and the other 2 lived into young adulthood. So when she married, she became very wealthy because this man, who was much older, did have a lot of money and power at the time. So when he died, she was widowed at the age of 25. So now she has 4 kids, no husband, and a whole ton of money. And that is when she met George Washington. So after she met George and married him, then, of course, George Washington accumulated all of this power and wealth. So originally he didn't have all of that, but he actually was a little bit of a gold digger, I suppose, in that sense that he did accumulate some wealth by his marriage to Martha. So a couple other things about Martha. Her and George Washington did not have any children, but they did raise the 2 remaining children from her first marriage together. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes from her today. So this is taken from a book called Wit and Wisdom of America's First Ladies. So it's mostly a book of quotations, and it's put together by Jocelyn Pine. So Martha Washington was born June 2nd, 1731, and then she died May 22nd, 1802. So she was, of course, our very first lady. She wasn't necessarily given that title since it was so new, but often she was referred to as Lady Washington. There were no precedents, so a little bit of background before we get into the quotes. The author shares a couple things with us. There were no precedents for the role of Martha Washington had thrust upon her at the age of 58 when her second husband became the first president of the new republic in 1789. The 2 were aptly considered trailblazers, as together they had helped define and shape what might be expected of a chief executive and his helpmate who, unlike British heads of state, had not inherited their position by virtue of blood. Martha was known for her courage, making frequent visits to her husband's field headquarters during the Revolution, which was a means of showing her commitment to the cause as well. Lady Washington, as she came to be called, also distinguished herself as a superlative hostess, the first of her kind. For the sake of preserving her privacy, and at a considerable cost to her posterity, Martha burned most of her correspondence with her husband before her death. I have learned from experience that the greater part of our happiness or misery depends on our dispositions and not on our circumstances. We carry the seeds of one or the other about us in our minds wherever we go. On being the First Lady. I live a very dull life here, and know nothing that passes in town. I never go to any public place. Indeed, I am more like a state prisoner than anything else. There are certain bounds set for me which I must not depart from, as I cannot do as I like. I am obstinate and stay at home a great deal. On the ceremonies of mere etiquette that accompanied the First Lady's role. I sometimes think that arrangement is not quite as often to have quite I sometimes think that arrangement is not quite as it ought to have been, that I, who had much rather be at home, should occupy a place with which a great many younger and gayer women would be extremely pleased. I have learned too much of the vanity of human affairs to expect felicity from the scenes of public life. Though I may not have a great deal of business of consequence, I have a great many avocations of one kind or another which imperceptibly consume my time. I have been so long accustomed to conform to events which are governed by public voice that I hardly dare indulge any personal wishes which cannot yield to that. On Thomas Jefferson, who had been fiercely critical of her husband's policies, he is one of the most detestable of mankind, the greatest misfortune our country has ever experienced. On her husband's retirement from the presidency, the general and I feel like children just released from school or from a hard taskmaster, and we believe that nothing can tempt us to leave the sacred roof tree again, except on business or pleasure. I think our country affords everything that can give pleasure or satisfaction to a rational mind. I am fond only of what comes from the heart. So the very last First Lady that we'll be discussing in our series is Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams did not have quite the same beginnings as Martha Washington. She came from a political family, but she did not actually receive a formal education because she was often sick growing up. But she really loved learning. And so later in life, Adams would consider herself as someone who's deprived of an education because females especially were not given very much educational opportunity at the time. But although she did not receive a formal education, her mother taught her and her sisters to read and write. So her father's library, again, they were from a fairly well-off family, did contain a lot of English and French literature, so they were able to educate themselves by that means as well. And as Adams grew up, she read with her friends as well, and she became one of the most well-educated first ladies. So she started off not having a strong education through a formal means, but she did work really hard to make sure that she was educated in her own right, which I think is really cool, and I think influences a lot of her ideas that she shares later on with her husband and son, who also became president, about the importance of including women in the political process, women in education. So really, in that sense, she was very progressive for her time. So I'm going to read some quotes from her as well. They're also from Wit and Wisdom of America's First Ladies, which are edited by Jocelyn Pine. So, just like with Martha Washington, there's a little bit of an intro and background about her before we get into a couple quotes. So Abigail Smith Adams was born November 11th, 1744, and she died October 28th, 1818. She was the second First Lady, and she served in that role from 1797 to 1801. Abigail Adams is remarkable among First Ladies for being the wife of one president and the mother of another. And she was the first to live in the White House, but her formidable intellect, strong character, and moral courage overshadow such facile labels. Her husband, John, considered his wife fully his equal, and as such, his key advisor on all important political issues, keeping in mind that he was on the Committee of Five who drafted the Declaration of Independence. She was fiercely opposed to slavery and voiced her objections voraciously, unafraid of exposing the hypocrisy behind the avowed principles continued to exist within the nation's borders. She was also a staunch champion of women's rights, urging her husband to include them in the governing process at a time when women didn't have the right to vote. So here are some of her quotes. There are times in which a genius would wish to live. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. All history will convince you of this, and that wisdom and penetration are the fruits of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure. And from a 1775 letter to a friend. Is it not better to die the last of British freemen than live the first of British slaves? From a 1777 letter to her husband. Posterity, who are to reap the blessings, will scarcely be able to convince the hardships and sufferings of their ancestors. Merit, not title, give a man preeminence. No man ever prospered in the world without the consent and cooperation of his wife. One other selection I'd like to read for you today. Abigail Adams did write a lot of letters. So she wrote 124 letters from a total of 14 locations. And she wrote 17 different people, including John Adams, Mary Cranch, and John Quincy Adams, her son. Most of her letters were written in 1775. Several other letters were written in 1785 and 1786. So in 1776, she wrote this letter to her husband, John Adams, and what she said in part of the letter is this: I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken, and notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. Charmed by accepting, by submitting sway, yet we have our humor most when we obey. And that's just a piece of her letter to her husband, advocating for including women in the political process. I hope that you've enjoyed our First Lady Friday series and have learned something about some of our most influential women in American history. I'm looking forward to our next Friday program that we'll be working on together. So we're going to be reading Anne of Green Gables, like I said at the beginning of the video. So each week we'll read a chapter or two, and there will be some discussion questions that you'll find in your program guide that goes out to all of our Marconi members. So feel free to call a friend and discuss the individual chapters you're reading or discuss the whole book when we've gone through it all together. But I hope that you enjoy our upcoming program and that you'll let us know if you are reading the book with us. Thanks. Have a great Friday.